Smoky Banks is a heaven on the northern beaches. A quaint little eco-herb nestled on the beaches of an ocean and at the end of a large river. The little herb is peaceful and idyllic. Communities live out happy lives in bountiful, lush gardens. The gardens grow over homes and pour over every inch of land, creeping up buildings, old and new. Frequent rain and fog give the herb its name, but most afternoon, sunlight turns the raindrops and dewdrops into a sea of diamonds on the kaleidoscopic display of life that houses and feeds the inhabitants of Smoky Banks. The town smells of sharp, salt air and sweet rains. Standing in the middle of the gardens, the sound of children laughing and playing rolls together with adults chatting, lovers whispering, and the bustle of a community hard at work maintaining the delicate balance of a live-in ecosystem. Smoky Banks is heaven on the beach. But far on the outskirts of town, ruins remind its inhabitants of history and lore known and unknown. And further yet, there is the wild. The dark, unknown miles of trees untouched by humanity. Out here in the outskirts of society, those miles of wilderness feel close. They feel present. But it was not always like this. There is a story that leads to a heaven on the beach, surrounded by fog, tall trees, and mysteries. So, to start with, this is our new game. This is Wanderlust. We're going to be doing a little bit of world building here in the first episode. And just to kind of explain the theming that I'm going with in this story, the aesthetic of this little town and really all of the cities and towns that still exist in the world is solar punk, right? Which is, like, by its Wikipedia definition, it embraces sustainability like gardening and regenerative design, like a do-it-yourself ethics that are basically about like local green infrastructure that is meant to be sustainable and last for a really long time. That's what communities are built around now. And this is basically like the result of a progression of history. The kind of feeling that I want to go into this game with is the difference between a manufactured environment that is meant to sustain human life versus what you would find out in actual wilderness allowed to go to the wild, where things are not necessarily conducive or beneficial for human survival, but there is still something mysterious and fascinating and sometimes scary or beautiful about that, is that there's this idea that we have, even if we have a world without scarcity, there is still this interest in going into something that is not meant for us. And that's kind of what I'm playing with this game, is this juxtaposition between this really peaceful, beautifully built and maintained community versus the horrors of the wild that kind of call to you a little bit. But for these first few episodes, we're basically doing the world building of the history that leads up to a solar punk world where everyone lives in these eco-herbs that are basically live-in gardens where people work a certain amount of every day to just maintain their food source and keep their like kind of closed loop ecosystem functioning and feeding themselves. And then, you know, that'll kind of be our home base that we go on adventures from. But what we're starting with is a point in history, what I'm calling like 5 eras-ish ago, which an era is not necessarily a rigid length of time. It's just kind of event-based. So there's kind of like 5 stages that humanity went through, going from a like world focused on production to one where large portions of the planet have been let return to the wild. And now society lives in eco-orb. So we're kind of plotting out or, you know, world building out that transition between these 2 points. So to start out with, we're just going to start with like the basic whole world scale stuff about this planet. So this is not our Earth. This is not our history. It's alternate world, alternate humanity. It's meant to not be like some post-apocalyptic version of Earth or something like that. This is whatever, humanity developed fully on another planet. That's where we're setting this story. So, to start with, the world. How big do we want just the planet in general to be?
I mean, I'm for huge.
I was going to say kind of small.
Well, I like the idea of, like, it was just, like, this ginormous planet, so the wilds are just this, like, huge encompassing space now. Like, something that's basically unfathomable seems captivating to me, not like... And I know, like, it'll be more than that. Like,
no, I'm thinking of in relation to Earth and how ginormous Earth really is. Like, how much of Earth I will never ever see.
Well, and also, how much of Earth is Earth because a large portion of it is water?
Yeah, so maybe we have, like, a predominantly land. What would you call that? Opposite of aquatic.
Yeah, I don't know. Terrarian?
Terrarian?
Yeah.
A terrarian world.
Terrestrial.
Terrestrial, yeah.
Well, I guess, is that a thing? Do we want small oceans? So, the nature of this town that is, like, so some things I will say, as we're doing this world building things, some things are fixed, some things are not. Like, I will say a fixed thing is there are not kangaroos with lasers on their backs. So, like, some things I can nix and have already decided.
Yeah, that's the koala bears, right?
Right. So one thing that is, like, pretty set is this is a coastal city on a body of salt water that has a river next to it. Partially because that explains somewhat why this town is still here. But also that, you know, that's just the aesthetic that I went for the world that I planned. So a little bit of it has to stay there. So I think there are some bodies of not fresh water.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So do we want that to be, though, like, not as common? Like, there's maybe not as much of that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe instead of 70% water on the surface, it's more like 50 or 40.
Okay.
What if we just, like, didn't have oceans? Like, not that we don't have salt water, just, like, the biggest thing we have is, like, Lake Superior.
I don't know.
I think that would be kind of weird.
I'm trying to make it kind of weird. I'm not trying to make it...
Zach just wants to make sure we don't overlap with his campaign where there's lots of water.
There are islands, like little things, but they're not, like, sailing distance. Or at least not, like, large seafaring sailing distance.
Also, to be fair...
Wanderlust, Sea of Thieves.
To be fair, like, Lake Superior, as far as, like, things go, is huge. Like, it's not like a puddle you can see across.
Oh, no, I know.
I think maybe a way of thinking about this is, do we want nations delimited by water? Like, large bodies of water? Because at some point, I think that a lot of that would fade as they're, like, the reason that, like, there are chunks of our world that are so separate is because they are divvied up by massive bodies of, until very recently, near unpassable water.
I like the idea that you could easily circumnavigate the globe by walking.
Okay.
As in, like unlike Earth, where it's like you can technically do it if the conditions are right and you have an ice bridge.
Okay, so how about this? So the world is comparatively smaller than Earth in actual size, but much less water, but those are divided into, like, pretty massive, like, in, like, they would be landlocked seas, right? So, yeah. And probably then those seas would divvy up land because the passages around them are either mountainous or extreme weather, right? So if you have this large block of land, getting around it is harder than sailing across it because walking through the mountains is near impossible. So at some point you have to, water travel became far easier. Yeah,
but there's enough land that you could that you could theoretically walk.
Yeah. Okay, so I like that. So slightly smaller, more land than water, landlocked seas and rivers then that exist. Okay, what about, like, weather? How do we feel about, like, climate areas? Do we want there to be as many climates as there are on Earth, or is it more homogenous? How do you feel about that?
I don't want to have a Star Wars planet. I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all. It's only sand or only desert. I don't know what your plan was for Smoky Banks, but I know when we originally talked, we kind of talked about it feeling like the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, so this would be on a body of water and somewhat north that would, I guess, like, it being near water somewhat controls its temperature, and that, like, you know, bodies of water act as, like,
it tempers it, yeah.
Batteries. For
I still really like that was my point. Is I still really like that.
Yeah. So definitely, like, temperate forest still exists. But and it's
north enough on the West Coast that there's rain.
Right.
I kind of like the idea of, like, weather is, like, more gradual changes than like, you know, like where Earth, there's like a lot of mountains around where it's just like the Pacific is like very fertile or like lots of rain, and there's a mountain range, and then it's desert.
Yeah, right.
Like, I like the idea of like it being more like gradual changes. Like, there's like it's desert, but you have to go through like a lot of like savanna.
Well,
then like small shrubs, then big shrubs.
In the nature of it being that there is fewer bodies of water, that would kind of guarantee that there are more deserts, and that a lot of your, like, because rainfall would happen near to the oceans, right? Like, that is where you're going to have enough water evaporating that it would then condense and rain down on you. So even like freshwater lakes would cause that. So probably then there would be like a more gradual progression as you move away from those bodies of water and get less and less rain, that you would then hit patches of desert that are less like north-south oriented and more like distance from lake oriented, you know?
Deserts are after mountains, aren't they?
Well, yeah, but wouldn't that also be a function of like its distance from a body of water that would create rain? Does that make sense?
Yes, but I thought it had more to do with...
I mean, Texas is a desert, and it doesn't have mountains.
I mean, it's got the Rockies.
Do the Rockies touch Texas?
I think they go through the whole place. I think there was a Magic School Bus episode about this. About how, like, the water cycle, like, all the rain falls in the mountains because...
Rocky Mountains do not touch Texas.
No.
They stop at the top of Utah.
Oh, well.
Not Utah. New Mexico.
Well, I mean, even if it's, like, less steep mountains that, like, collect rainfall and then it, like, flows out... I think that if you were still, like, a extreme distance away from any body of water, you would have, like, drier climate, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it'd be less condensing into the...
Right.
Or evaporating into the air.
Right, because, like, basically, like Zach said, it's that, like, usually it hits mountains and that's where it, like, all rains and stops right there, and then it doesn't keep going past. But I think eventually it would just run out of steam going across the land. You know what I mean? Because it's like if a hurricane hits us, it's, like, gone so far and rained so much by the time it gets to us that there isn't, like, a ton still happening there. So you'd have storms, like, circulating in... like the coastal area, which is why it like rains every day here in Smoky Banks. But then by the time you get really far off into just inland nothing, it is like at best scrub and probably deserts there.
Yep. All of you climate folks out there, yell at us in the comments and tweet at us. And
yeah, if that's wrong, I don't care.
Well, the other thing I was going to say that seems interesting to me, which I don't think, since we're just going to be in Smoky Banks, I don't think it super matters. I like the idea that it's more gradual, but the extremes are higher on each end, where it's like, there's more hurricanes, but also, like, the deserts are hotter.
Would more hurricanes kind of guarantee that you would have to have larger bodies of water?
I don't honestly know.
I don't either.
Or whatever. Extreme weather seems interesting to me, and I like the idea of us having to deal with extreme weather in our setting and not just deal with, like, it's raining.
I think it has to do with water temperature somewhat. So maybe if the planet as a whole is warmer.
Or, you know, like, there are, like, thunderstorm. We don't have it where it rains every day. We have it where it thunderstorms every day. You know, and then as you get to the deserts are just, like, hotter and drier than they are here.
I mean, yeah, if you have these, like, more, like, localized pockets of weather, you know, due to there being more localized pockets of water, I think it would stand to reason that the deserts are worse, by comparison.
Yeah.
So I think that works. In terms of having extreme weather all the time, I'm not sure. Okay, so...
Or not all the time, just in general, you know?
Yeah. I like the idea of Smoky Banks being, like... Because it's supposed to be, like, kind of, like, foggy and mysterious at times, right? Like that. I do think the idea of pretty frequent thunderstorms is cool, just as, like, an aesthetic that you would see those, like, rolling over the forests, you know? Like, that's kind of fun. I enjoy that. So I think we can go with that, like, more thunderstorms are frequent throughout the year. What do we feel about seasons?
6 of them.
Well, I mean, you could say that we have 15 seasons now. It's like a kind of a, you know, gradual sway between temperatures, you know.
I mean, just where we live alone, we go through like 3 different winters interspersed by 3 different springs.
Right. But I guess, like, the nature of us having seasons is because our planet is tilted. So there's a part of the year where we are closer to the sun and a part of the year where we are further from the sun. So do we want that to be the case, that, like, as we orbit the sun, whatever sun that we orbit, that, like, the tilt of our planet guarantees that the weather is going to change pretty significantly in a given area? Or do we want it to be that it's consistent year-round, and then you just have, like, cold, consistently really cold areas, basically? you'd have a permafrost on the planet that would never go away.
I would like having variants, but maybe not super extremes.
Okay, yeah, so that would make sense.
Still like a winter, still a winter and a summer, but not Siberia to Sahara range.
Well, and I guess then you would have more areas that are like permatundra, and you would have more areas that are like
permadesert.
Yeah, well, I guess no, because our the center of our planet, that's why it's warm all the time, right? Because it's always the same distance from the sun, comparatively.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that would just mean that the caps of the planet would be, perma-cold. It would be very, when you get far enough north, it's the same amount of cold. You hit an area where, there is no life. And that could kind of be a thing that, being on the caps is, almost unheard of, because it is so cold there all of the time. And also, perpetually night. Would that be the case? Yeah, they would be, perpetually night, wouldn't they?
I think so.
No.
Well, no, at the poles, depending on the season,
it's either perpetual day or perpetual night.
Oh, yeah. You got it.
But that's because they're tilted one way or the other. So no, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. It would be the same. Sorry. Never mind. Okay. So I like all of that so far. What can we see from the night sky and what can we see from the day sky? That is to say, what are we orbiting? What else is up there?
This is just me. If I'm talking too much, by the way, and someone else wants to jump in, just let me know. But I like the idea of multiple moons and multiple suns always. I'm a sucker for it.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no reason or how it would work, but I'm just having 2 suns seems fun. Having 15 moons also seems cool.
I like the idea of a lot of moons.
Me too.
With a lot of moons, would that mean that tides are more severe or tides just don't happen? Depends on how they work.
They cancel each other out.
Yeah.
It would probably mean that they're weirder, right?
I wonder if they're not predictable.
It would mean that they would fluctuate a lot more and a lot more erratically.
If we have at least 2 moons, you'd get into a 3-body problem, right? And you couldn't predict.
No, what a 3-body problem is 3 objects rotating around each other.
And this
all
would be
3 are in
2.
motion.
I see.
This is, if we have 15 moons orbiting our planet, it's not a 3-body problem, it's a 2-body problem. Or if there's one stationary point and everything's orbiting it.
It's 14 2-body problems.
If one of the moons had its own moon, would that then turn it into a 3-body problem?
Again, no, because they're orbiting Earth. Earth would have to also be orbiting them.
Oh.
Yeah, 3-body problem is when there is none of the individual bodies are the center of rotation.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Where the center of rotation is out in space somewhere, and they're all rotating that center of that point in space.
But from my understanding, the answer is tides wouldn't be harder, they wouldn't be unpredictable, they'd just be harder to know. We just have high and low tide. If you start adding more moons in it, you're going to have more pulls on these bodies of water, causing different, you might have a mid-tide, or high tide in one place while it's low tide somewhere else, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea of it being, annoying enough that it is just no one bothers. You know what I mean? It's yes, we could. At some point, it just doesn't matter, you know?
Yeah.
It's gonna be, because it's this weird combination of, where all of these different moons are in all of their different orbits is going to affect greatly, how all of these things work.
I like the idea of the tides are named after the moons.
Oh yeah, that's a fun idea.
And so if something weird is happening, they're oh, that's just
yeah.
Stell tide, that's what it is. And so there's somewhat of a, not a mythology, but
there probably would be at some point. I don't know if there still is now.
Yeah, but I'm thinking more Mercury's in retrograde, that astrology.
Yeah, a horoscope kind of thing. Yeah,
I was going to make that joke. I'm Caitlin, did you just invent astrology in Cody's setting?
But it's just the type of thing it's that tide,
Yeah. No, that's fun. That's a fun way to put it. I like that idea. Okay, and I'm going to say my addition to, if we have multiple suns, I think then as you're orbiting those multiple suns, you're going to be getting different shades of light hitting the planet at different times of the year, which then I think means that seasoning is based on what sun you're getting. So your temperature might not fluctuate that much, but the color spectrum might. So there might be
ooh, I love that so much.
A season where you would see different colors of plants, or only certain plants bloom because they evolved to bloom in the presence of this kind
light.
of light.
Yeah.
Because that would kind of make a cool thing for the gardens, like the hues changing constantly as you're rotating around the sun. That's cool. I like that.
I love that a lot.
Okay. We already answered a little bit of this because of like the salt versus not salt water, that the salt water bodies are relatively smaller, although still pretty massive. And we already talked about like sorry, I'm going through like a list here that I have written out. So as we already answered some of these questions, I have to kind of mark them off my list. So I think as is typical, like, what's it called? Water is focused around areas where there is it. So like as you get further from where rain falls, you'll have less and less plant life. So I think there are areas of the planet where like water and therefore like plant life is pretty scarce. But in general, how do we imagine like plant and animal life looking? Do we want it to be pretty near Earth with, minor modifications? Do we want there to be any exceptions to it?
I'm going to say, for the sake of kind of what my character is going to want to do, I would say it might be a little easier to keep it closer to Earth style with modifications.
Yeah, we can't get too outlandish.
Especially if we're already dealing with different, like, moon and sun not issues, but you know what I mean? Like that's going to change things, and that's totally fine. But, like, I think if we stick with Earth type of, like, we've got an apple.
Right.
But that apple could have, like, 3 different modifications just based on what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So, and obviously, I think, fantasy foods and animals are on the table because that's fun.
I like that.
But that keeps it, that keeps it grounded a little bit for everybody.
I like that idea.
Can I say that there's maybe more reptiles than Earth, perhaps more reptiles than mammals? I guess that's probably true of Earth anyway, but just if it's hotter.
Maybe they're more visible.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't be as much of a guarantee that warm-blooded...
Like having fur wouldn't be the best thing in the world. Like being able to quickly regulate your temperature depending on like...
Right, you wouldn't need to be as warm-blooded, especially depending on where you are. Like if you're in an area where there isn't as much temperature fluctuation or just at all, you might not need to be able to keep your own body warm. Oh, you know what I think that opens up the possibility of is more like middle of the road stuff?
Like mid-size?
Well...
Or like fusion.
Lots of frogs.
Animals that like amphibians, right? Like live half in the water and half above air. Like I'm thinking a classification of animal that can regulate its body temperature to a degree, but not as much. So you'd have more like...
Okay.
I'm imagining like kind of furry reptiles or scaly mammals, right? That like don't need as much to regulate their body temperatures. Just because of the environment, not because of, not because of like technological advancements or because they just live in the desert.
Well, and it could also be like, it could be like a more extreme version of what our own dog does. Like we have a corgi who sheds like crazy when summer comes because he's dropping all of that extra winter coat that he gets. But then he's able to it grows back in the winter, and it can be that type of like just a very extreme version of that.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Cause then it could be like
kind of like geographically motivated too. Like you have a Bernese Mountain Dog, right?
No, I have a Tibetan Mastiff.
Oh, Tibetan Mastiff, right? So like if you're in a cold area, it would grow fur. If you ever take that dog to a hot area though, it would start shedding, So, like, it self-regulates that as it realizes that it doesn't need as much hair. Like, being in a cold area stimulates hair growth. That's kind of fun. Mm-hmm. Which I think actually is true for humans, that, like, we grow more facial hair in cold areas. I think that might be true. Doesn't matter.
I like the idea that all animals, like, self-regulate a lot faster than we do on Earth.
Well, they would need to self-regulate based on location, because we said that there aren't seasons, right? So it'll either be they change based on like migration if they're migratory animals, or they don't really ever have to.
Well, would migration still happen?
I think so. Maybe. Yeah, if there's seasons.
Well, we said that there were, but they were a lot less extreme.
Well, seasons are based on light, so depending on like food supplies, then. So yeah.
So that might be what it is that you'd be chasing other forms of light. But I mean, even then, like some migration, it's like based on food availability. So it might be like eating through an area and then going to the next area until that area regrows or whatever.
And I like the idea of like you were talking about hybrids, of like animals can look really different if they're in hot versus cold environments. So like the same animal could look a lot more like a reptile in a warmer place and look basically like a mammal in a colder place. And that is like an interesting puzzle for biologists because
it's a fun idea.
You can identify something and then have it look really different.
Right.
It's
somewhere
kind of like
else and not necessarily know it's the same thing.
Kind of like on, what is it, like grasshoppers and locusts, where like they're the same animal.
Uh-huh.
But it's just like depends on like environments where it's like for a long time people are like, where do locusts come from? And they're like, oh, they're grasshoppers.
So does anyone plant life? I think we already talked about basically its seasonality is largely based on what light sources are hitting it. So you might have times when certain trees are bears and then different colored trees bloom at that time, you know, because you're getting different kinds of light. I like that idea.
I like the idea of there's like, this is just like very small scale, but I like the idea of there's a fruit that changes color depending on what light it's produced in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I think the trees would be different colors based on what light they're produced in.
Well, like, I think there's like different trees that bloom. Like, there's like a tree that blooms in sun 1 and tree that blooms in sun 2. And I want there to be a tree that blooms all the time.
Oh, but like, yeah, it's like foliage and fruiting would change color.
Right. Like it makes, you know, like it makes purple pears for sun A, and then it just makes red pears for sun B.
I like that. I think that's fun because it's not too far, but it's like far enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not too alien, but alien enough. Okay, so in terms of like just planet-wide stuff, anything else people want to add, change? I imagine we still have like gravity and things like that, you know? It's about the same.
No, gravity's out.
No gravity on the planet.
Really buried the lead there.
I'm trying to think if there's anything.
I think we have a lot to work with.
We can always go back. I'll say that if we ever like decide that we hate some part of this, going back is always an option. Okay, so then what I want to talk about right now is Era 1. And Era 1 is basically what in the world causes us to realize as an entire world that a drastic change in civilization is needed, right? So the like match up for our world would be like facing things like global warming and like food scarcities and water shortages because of overpopulation and greenhouse gases, right? Like that's like the that's like the environmental strife that we're facing right now. Now we're thinking about a fictional world based on this world that we built up. This is meant to be like modern times, right? So this is...
Can we do like near future? Like,
well, that's where that's the time period that we're getting into. It can be a little bit before, it can be a little bit after, but for any of this to work, it requires things like society is advanced globally far enough that we're aware of society globally.
Okay.
You know, and like capable of communicating and coordinating, which is like in terms of like our history, like what, the last 100 years, 200 years? Like that's pretty recent realistically in the terms of all of civilization.
Right.
That we could make a decision as a group. So that's around the time period we're looking at. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about is the technology. Like how far do we think we are? What do we think we have? What do we think we don't? That's kind of my curiosity right now.
So I had an idea that kind of like wraps into like where our problems stem from, and that's technology based. But I thought of the idea where we basically make like a universal food converter where you can basically shove any like organic material in and it just like produces something edible. But the problem with this is that it like basically like strips out like 99% of the nutrients. So like to use this, it's like easy and
so it's extremely inefficient, is what you're saying.
It's horribly inefficient, but it's super easy to do. Where you can like shove anything into it basically, and out pops a food pill. But the amount you need to put into it is like ridiculous. And
so we end up just stripping the planet of natural resources for food.
Right. Like so it's like people could.
Okay, so I'm going to list this as extreme monoculture. So if you had a world where you didn't need to grow a diversity of food, like right now we have to grow, like a reason that we're relatively well fed is that we can eat a very wide diversity of food. We're not eating just one thing. If you could take anything and like synthesize that into a pretty wide spectrum of things. Or if it's like you take that and mix it with a multivitamin, you know, you really wouldn't have a need to grow anything but one thing, and that would be the most efficient thing, is you make super grain that's like takes as little nutrient as possible to grow, takes as little as water as possible to grow, you know, is like everything resilient, and you just plant that everywhere, you know? And
then that could lead into like a disaster where that one monoculture gets some kind of disease and makes it not possible to use anymore, which then devastates the planet.
I like the idea of extreme monoculturing, and then, you know, like it's like that banana plague, right? Like that's a thing that we're dealing with right now.
Right.
This is just a symptom, but I think one of the reasons that society realizes we absolutely have to change, otherwise we're not going to be here anymore, is so the tides are erratic because of the moons that we have. And so like chaos is normal, but all of a sudden it's not. The water is still. And like you get it occasionally, but for whatever reason, whatever technology is doing right now, it has done something that we are not getting the same tide pool anymore. Gravitational pull.
Let me think about that for a second.
And it's just like I said, it's like it's more of a symptom than.
Well, I really like that. What if we had it where, like during this time, like how we're super reliant on fossil fuels, and that really screws over like everything on Earth. What if we had it where everything here was like hydroelectric, like to the point where it's just like the lakes, like we don't have currents because we have too many pumps in the water.
That could be it.
What if like so this is my addition, right? Because this is something that I thought of when Zach said this. So I said that like the arable land is pretty, like the land gets worse the further you get from the water, right? So it would stand to reason that the areas that would be cultivated would be with this monoculture of, you know, super wheat would be right by the water, and then, you know, less leading out, right? So I think then people move away from there because it's just like, why put a city where there could be fields, put fields there. So people start moving into the desert. So I think that it got like so extreme, like the need for like pulling water, and also like, I like the idea of like, you know, damming, and because that could be it, is like making like really like series of like dams and irrigation and stuff like that actually changed the level of the water in these lakes enough that like you would start getting like they could level the water just by adjusting dams and stuff, because that could make as much of a change as tidal pulls. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like it is like this weird, eerie, ominous thing that like people used to talk about, like, oh, it'd be fun to like go and see like these crazy waves. There was probably like a huge culture of surfing, you know, but now it's like all of that has been like controlled and automated to such a degree to just pump it into the ground to like hydrate all of these crops that it like now is totally placid, and it's like a recreation has died because of it, like because that now like that water has just become a tool.
And I think that would lead to a lot of growth in the water too if it was not moving as much.
Oh, you know, that could be the source of the blight that kills the stuff.
Yeah, is like
stagnant water.
That happened in real life, actually, in Arizona, California.
All right, what about, like, let's look kind of away from, like, the production of food and, like, really, like, the backbone of civilization and go to some more, like, everyday stuff. Like, what do we see a normal person's day looking like? How is it different than our life? How is it the same? Keeping in mind that I think people are largely moving to
desert, arid areas.
Desert metropolises that are like very weird, like almost like, I don't think that it would be so far as they have like stupid lawns with irrigation, you know, like, but I think that there is like water features are really important as like a display of wealth, you know, like.
Mm-hmm. So Dubai.
Kind of, yeah. You know, like these, I mean, it's like Vegas too, you know, like we have these like weird desert landlocked cities for no reason.
Yeah, it's like by any definition, like, what is the city in, is Dubai the city? I can't even remember if that's the city or.
I think it is, yeah.
Okay. Like, you should not be able to exist there. Humans should not survive there, but we throw enough money at the problem and it works.
Yeah, so, like, cooling is a requirement. Waste, it, like, who knows what we do with it. We just dump it in the desert somewhere, you know, like, it is entirely, like, segregated humanity from its food that has just taken over the whole planet. So, day-to-day life at this point. What do we think people are like?
I think... Can I say something for houses?
Sure, yeah.
I think... Well, this might be a later thing when it's more a thing, but I think, like, doors aren't really a thing in this culture as much. It's much more just, like, everything's, like, open air. And, like, there are, like, dividers and, like, curtains and stuff, but it's less like how we have it here where everything has a door because we need to keep heat in. Since everything's about keeping heat out, like, things just are, like, made for breezes to go through constantly.
It's trying to promote airflow.
Yeah.
Okay.
A la, like, ancient Egyptian palaces kind of thing, where it's just, like, there isn't really, like, air conditioning or indoors in the same way. It's just, like, we have giant arches, and then you put, like, sunscreens up in the hot part of the day to, like, keep heat out.
I think, okay, so here's my issue with that, is I think that cooling would be necessary, but I like the idea of these, like, open air mixed spaces, because, like, even, like, cities that have more, like, consistent, like, you know, we live in a place that gets pretty cold and it rains, so, like, outdoor spaces are tricky. I like the idea of large portions of the city, especially, like, markets, recreational areas, being assumed to be sort of like this pseudo-in outdoors areas, but then I do think that, like, domiciles and especially nighttime sleeping areas have to be crazy cooled. Like, that is necessary, just because it's the desert and it's going to be too hot.
Would those all be underground?
Well, again, we're dealing with a society that has problems, so they probably should be. But are they at the time? You know, there's a reason why people stop doing this. We're defining a society that has problems right now.
Quick question, though. Like, in real life, deserts are actually super cold at night.
Well... yeah, that's true. That's a fair point. I don't know. Does Arizona get, like, super cold at night?
Cold. They definitely get colder.
If there's not, like, humidity holding the heat, then it's like the moon, you know?
Okay, so during the day, desert temps can rise to a little over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, they fall to an average of about 25 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Oh, dang. Okay. So really at night we would need heating. So that's the tricky part, is at nighttime you'd need closed off heating areas. Okay.
Since we're trying to have a society that has problems, why don't, like, they start building houses like we have houses now, where in the day they, like, try to super cool it, and at night they don't. And then they have to, like, superheat it, so they're just, like, burning through energy.
Well,
like,
and it's like, and I'll say it doesn't have to be, like, all bad. We don't have to define the worst case scenario, but I do think that they're, like, I like the idea of open air markets being, like, a pretty common thing. I think that's kind of a cool idea, especially maybe it's, like, kind of a nightlife. Oh, that's kind of a fun idea. Like, it switches to kind of like a nightlife society, you know? Like,
oh, where there's, like, it makes sense to have, like a huge fire or something, and then, like, stuff is around that, and so you hang out there because it's warm.
Well, no, I just mean that, like, if during the day it's so hot that you can barely function, people would work a lot more in, like, the afternoon and morning, and then be in temperature-controlled areas at night. So, like, your, like, fun areas are in the evening when it's, you know, 70 degrees and nice, but, like, in the middle of the day, you have to go to temperature-controlled areas because it's so hot.
I do like the fires, though.
And yeah, I mean, like, yeah, sure, fires at night. I like that idea, too. Like, that's kind of like a cool image, especially because it's kind of like, again, one of those things where you're having to, like, constantly keep fires lit at night that everyone's dancing around, you know, which is itself its own problem, you know, however you're getting that, whether it's like a fossil fuel or if it's, you know, like using electricity to split hydrogen out of water to burn, you know.
So I think that a problem that I'm going to import from current time here into this one is that people are having to travel to their workplace. So there is still a rat race of having to, like, people leave their homes every day to go to a building when you could be doing work at home. You can do it, or, you know, you're having to travel a far distance to commute to your job.
I like the idea, too, that it's hard to get infrastructure out to these places, so they just have, like, really long, like, they have a longer commute.
Oh, yeah, because the towns keep moving further and further away as more and more land keeps getting taken over for agriculture.
And I also kind of like the idea of, like, if this is a planet where we have a lot of land comparatively, and, you know, even if more and more of it's getting eaten up by farmland, if there's, like, large portions of desert that can't be turned into farmland easily, I think suburban sprawl totally makes sense. That, like, people are like, oh, whatever, there's, like, so much nothing out here, just build forever. So, you know, you, like, hit these deserts and it's just, like, forever housing, you know? And then, like, if you have, like, a tech, like, a, you know, an industrial job that is, like, you know, whatever, you know, the mill is near the center of the city, you gotta, cart your way all the way up there.
Well, and if this is a production-based society, then you probably have companies or people that are, like, purchasing stupidly huge amounts of land and just like, well, we'll just do whatever we want here, and building, like, but that means nobody's living right next to it.
Right. Well, and because then they would want it to look aesthetic. So, like, you know, oh, we want to make a new production plant for whatever things, you know, and then it's like, so you have to, like, buy, like, 1,000 acres out in the middle of nothing, and you make it look all beautiful. You have your necessary water feature, you know, and then you have to, like, build a highway out to it that connects to all the other stuff. Do we think people have cars?
I don't know if it's cars specifically, but I do feel like if we're creating the, like, we need to, this is the point where, like, society decides that we have to change, it's got to be something that's, like, fossil fuel burning or something that's not helping, you know?
Right.
I like the idea of just, like, having these, like, ridiculously large commuter trains.
I think probably it's both.
It's like DC, where you've got the metro that pulls you in, but you also have 1 million people on the road trying to get into DC in the morning.
Yeah. Well, and that might be one of those, like, kind of like not enough fixes of, like, oh, we'll build a train and that'll fix all of our commuter issues, is like people still work 100 miles from their house, you know?
I was going to say that, like, as the commute gets farther and farther, they, like, want to incentivize using the train. So the train ends up becoming, like, this huge, like, luxury thing. And so it becomes really, like, unwieldy and unsustainable because they're trying to make it like, oh, you have to spend an hour and a half on here. We're going to make it super lavish. Yeah. So that you want to use it.
Oh, yeah. It's like riding first class as being on the train. Yeah. I like that.
Right. And so it's not the way we think of trains of, like, everybody crammed onto there. They're, like, trying to make it huge.
You're like, lower class workers are not using this. It's like, oh, I'm an executive. I'll get on the train for 2 hours and get into work by noon.
Well, I also like the idea of just, like, it being like commuter trains are just, like, really small comparatively to other trains. Like, in our world.
Oh, yeah.
You know, where they're, like, 4 or 5 cars, I think. You know trains, Cody, I don't.
They pull a lot less. Yes, they're more than 4 or 5 cars, but yes, they weigh a lot less.
But then I'm thinking, like, for these trains, it's not, like, 4 or 5 cars. It's, like double the length we see of, like, freight trains now, where it's just, like, there's, like, 5 dozen cars of this.
Sure. Well, and, you know, something I was thinking of, so this is my little addition to this, is I like the idea that, fossil fuels were largely, at least in this world, discovered in more desert areas. So as people started moving to the desert more and more and more, fossil fuel became more largely produced. So we were having issues with, like, overusing, like, hydroelectric power. That became difficult because it's so far away. Then we started burning fossil fuels, like, rapidly. Because, like, we kind of, like, slowly built up to burning fossil fuels, which is why I think sometimes people are like, oh, it's not that bad, you know? But it'd be like, immediately, it's like there are huge cities that are like, we're burning fossil fuels now. You know what I mean?
For everything, yeah.
So it accelerated, like, when that happened, the need of it accelerated way faster, you know? Mm-hmm. It was super fast that people started needing fossil fuels. And then things like, so I like the idea of that, like, cars and trains are a little bit more primitive, like, they're less advanced than we have them now because they're a relatively newer thing to be commonplace. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, because it's like you have all this power from fossil fuels suddenly, and it feels like, oh, this, like, produces so much, it can go on forever. We don't need to make it very efficient.
Right.
And so, like, if the engines are primitive compared to ours because they're just not very efficient, and you just burn more.
Yeah, super dirty. You're, like, burning oil.
So, I have a controversial idea or problem. I like the idea that we never invent internet, or, like, people never invents the internet, so that we don't have instantaneous communication. And there could be stuff like radio, but it's not like we don't have like fiber or like...
How do we have global communications?
Yeah, that's the issue, is some of this is predicated on the ability for us to talk to each other.
How fast do you want global communication? Because like the world has been globalized for a while before internet, there was globalization in the 60s, and like phones could still exist.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is the hop between people inventing basically the radio and the internet existing is actually a relatively small hop. Like, you figure out how to send radio frequency, all the internet is encoded digital signals. You know what I mean? The media, I guess what I'm saying of transmission is kind of irrelevant. If you have the radio, you can transfer data instantaneously across the planet, basically. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the reliability thing, but that's fine if we want to keep the internet. I think...
I don't know. What's everyone else's thought on this? I would say my assumption is that a certain degree, I don't know to what degree, but a certain extent of relatively instantaneous communication across the planet is kind of necessary for this to work.
Well, like, I think or maybe it's not common. Because I think, to me, it makes sense why people...
Do you think that... What do we think about computers at this stage of, humanity existing?
So, I think that in Era 1, I think that it is either common or, like, almost common. But the thing is, we can, like, backslide. Like, I don't want to go too far into, like, the next eras. But, like... If we have like fiber internet underneath, and then all of a sudden, a big chunks of the planet are going back into the wild, no one's upkeeping that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I just thought it was like interesting for the reason to not have work from home is like just because like you can't.
Well, I mean, we didn't have work from home when we could for a long time just because people didn't like that. It didn't, people wanted to have offices full of people.
Right. I mean, like I'm trying to make it different. I'm trying to make it different from Earth, where it's not just like importing our like we don't have work from home because corporations want to like slave drive.
Well, and I mean, at some point, like, industry requires people to be there building to crap a lot of the times. I mean, unless they have, like, total automation on all these things, which that's a question. I mean, that is the larger question is, work from home is only possible in the last few years because of, the internet, but also because of, like, the nature of what our jobs has changed drastically in the last 50 years. We're not working at a factory, we're not making things. So working from home suddenly makes a lot more sense because you're not sitting at home making things. But that's a good question. Like, do we think that things are either automated to the point where human intervention in manufacturing is not as needed? Or do we think that, I think that's an issue of it, is that what you're talking about, Zach, is something that is unique to basically like professional management class people. But like, if you work in a restaurant or you work in like a fulfillment center or you work in industry, no one was working from home ever, and still aren't.
Right, but I mean, like a lot of like restaurants and stuff like that. Like,
what I'm saying is, I think you're talking about an actually relatively small portion of the population that even during a pandemic was able to work from home. My point is, I think though it brings up a good question of what is the need for a workforce in this society. I think is largely what you're getting to, and I think that's a good question to ask.
Yes. Well, I was also thinking of more like the people who are commuting a long way. Like, if you're commuting...
Yeah, I mean, people have to commute a long way now because largely because we have manufacturing separate from the workforce. Not because we have offices separate from the workforce. I mean, that too, but I don't think that's really the majority of it.
That's fine.
I think that is a part of it. So, either way, my point is, your workforce, what is the need for them? That is a largely important question. Does that kind of make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah.
It does, yeah.
Like, if you go, cars exist in some capacity, how are they made?
I like the idea, and again, this is like just me taking away technology, of us never inventing the microcontroller, where it's like you can have like, and this is like me going and saying we don't have internet again, so I'm not trying to just harp on that. But, like, the idea, like, where it's like a microcontroller was, like, a very specific thing we invented that made all computers possible. Like, before that, we had to have tubes. So just like, we have to do stuff because robots don't exist. There is no automation at all, and that's why jobs happen.
How does everyone else feel about it?
Again, I'm not, like, this is not, like, the one idea I want.
Yeah, I guess I understand I was going to say instinct. That's not the right word. Your I guess, want to not just repeat our existing world, but I don't feel like we need to make it the anti-Earth.
So my thought on this is that, beyond a certain point, the goal of industry is always to cut out its own workforce. People are generally the most expensive part of industry, so there's always going to be a drive to figure out ways to cut out more people and to automate away necessary jobs, right? So that's, if people want to make money on industry, which I think this time period that would be a guarantee of it. So I think that some degree of automation will exist. I like the idea of it meaning something different though. What's up, Mandy?
What if this is and this will, obviously roll into the other eras, but what if what it is this is the time, right when that kind of automation is starting to be a thing. So
that's a cool idea.
It's in its super basic core or super basic parts. So there could be some potentially in further eras, but because this is the point where this society is going, okay, wait, but we gotta stop. We have to do something different. They don't necessarily go much farther, so that and that forces that, so that way we can have maybe a couple sprinklings of that technology here and there, but it also forces us to have to look into potential other ways. That also means that the workforce is still needed in industry, because we're not at the point where somebody can just stand off to the side and make sure that the robots are running.
I actually really like that idea. I think that it makes a lot of sense for a thing that is, which now this is going to lead me into a plot point that I'm actually really excited about. So I like the idea that, one of the allowing factors is a sudden boom in technology brought about by, like Zach said, basically the invention of microprocessing, or you could say tinyifying of transistors. I don't really know what you would call that first thing that was computers exist as this revolution, because it was sort of this nebulous time where from World War II to the 80s we were inventing computers as they are now.
It's basically the crux point, I think, is the switching from tube computers to microcontrollers.
Right. And I mean, there was even a middle ground there of it doesn't matter. But yes, I agree with you. I think that saying that we're in that stage and it's not totally done yet, but we're already beginning to feel the ripples of it is a cool place to be. And in terms of technology, yeah, maybe right now what you have is radio broadcast, and even maybe that's what it is we are one of the inventions that was made at this time was a radio encoder, which lets you send information rapidly, right? Because basically it lets you, as quickly as you can pulse a signal and be read by, even if it is tube, you could then read that as text back out of a machine. But, if that is a pretty large thing, that might be each city has one of these, encoder, decoder, we can type a message, hit send, and it sends to this city over here. But that allows for really rapid communication between places. And
I think that's more what I was going for, where it's just
So does that mean if for personal communication you get put in a queue, and so you can send a message across the world, but it's not instantaneous?
That's actually kind of a fun idea, that this encoding thing is there are blasts that happen every so often. So yeah, you it's getting the mail, but you can get it from anywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of a fun idea, that there's a hived, because text is so small comparatively, you could send every written word ever in one flash drive.
It's kind of like how they do in Deadly Education, where it's just when all the students come in, they all carry messages from home, because it's the only way to get stuff in. Or it's just well, you got to attach this to something. This is the one time,
yeah.
You got to attach this to something important.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your text isn't going through.
And you guys can feel free to reject this. It's just a thought I had talking about technology and automation. I also I was imagining that with the society being hyper reliant on the one crop, they had built very specific specialized, this can't be used for anything else. like some kind of automation, whether it's like just a special tractor.
Harvesters and stuff.
Only good for harvesting this stuff. And then
that could even be mechanically, like like a corn combine can't pick strawberries.
Exactly, it's something like that where they've spent a lot of money and effort into making that process as efficient as possible with automation. It might not be computers specifically; it could be, like you're saying, mechanical automation. But and then when that goes south, then they have all this technology that's useless.
I mean, that could even be like literally on rails.
Yeah.
Like there could be like massive rail structures across these fields to like drag these like water harvester, planter machines back and forth across, And that also works because you have really specialized labor that only knows how to do like, I know how to fix cog B on the machine.
The machine.
No, that's like a cool image of like, you remember in the past, like the going down to the beach is like driving through these forests and onto like these giant crashing waves and there's all this plant life. And now you like drive out there and it's just like totally flat. One thing, like this big smog pumping machine, like slowly creeping across it, That's kind of that's a pretty miserable image. I like that. Okay, so we're actually running out of time, so when I said this was going to be 2 episodes, I'm now thinking it's probably going to be more like 3 or 4, because we talked longer than I thought.
You should have learned from Companion's Tale. This was inevitable.
So what I want to cover before we're done for today, there's basically 2 big things, which is religion, if there is any, and nations. Like, how do we envision nations working together, and are there them?
I have religion. I have one that I really, really want to do.
Go for it.
So did we decide there are 3 moons?
No, there's a bunch.
There's a bunch.
Yeah, there's like
okay. So I think that there is a religion that this is from like ancient times and it's kind of suppressed in this era. But I think there might be still like symbology related to it. That worships the Moon Sisters.
Was that like 2 interlocked moons or something?
No. Well, you said there's multiple ones.
Yeah.
I was going to say the 3 sisters because I thought there were 3, but it's just like the moons in general.
Oh, so it's like a pantheon kind of.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
I like
it's
that.
Like a pantheon of moon goddesses that are worshipped.
Can I add something to that?
Maybe. What do you want to add?
That somewhere in the history of that religion, there is like a near apocalyptic, like in the past, apocalyptic event that is like talked about, like the War of the Sisters or whatever. And it was that way back in human history, humanity witnessed 2 moons collide in the sky.
I like that.
That's fun.
Right? And then like that became this story of like these 2 like great champions that went to war with each other and like smashed. And you know what? Okay, I'm adding something. There's actually like your planet has 1 ring, and that is one of the moons destroyed the other, and now it's like a dust ring. And so there's like like the dust ring is like the body of the dead god, and then there's the goddess, and that one goddess is still there that's like now the king of everything. That's a cool idea.
Like the main one. It's definitely like the biggest one.
The best, yeah.
Can I add the competing religion? Like, if we're having moon goddesses, I think there's a sun religion, since there's 2 suns.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that religion focuses all on duality.
Oh, yeah. It's the dialect.
There's, like, the good sun and the bad sun. Or I don't think it'd be good and bad, but, like, the harmony sun and the chaos sun.
Well, no, that almost kind of works, that they're, like, the like, moons are treated, like, with a lot more nuance, Like, they're either, like, conceptual, like this is like like the moon goddess of harvest, and this is the moon goddess of technology, and this is the moon god, like there's a moon goddess of everything. But then like the sun deities are like way more like
black or white,
good, bad, war, harmony. It's just like all like good stuff and bad stuff.
Well, that's a big reason that I would say like I don't know if you envision the sun religion to be more like I imagine that it's probably a little bit more dominating in the culture. And I think it's kind of like how we would view like, for the Moon Sisters, it's how like Greek gods are viewed now, where it's like, yeah, you're going to see iconography to like Zeus and Aphrodite, and there's references, But generally, people don't worship them unless it's like, people don't outwardly do that. There's not temples to Zeus anymore.
I think these are different nations. Like, I think that those are two cultures that develop separately. So, like, the culture that had, like, was more sun worshipping, I think that is maybe, like, wasn't entirely different. I asked about nations and religion, right? So that could be, like, they are coming into context with each other kind of more now. That, like, you maybe both developed two different religions after that, but that is in, like, the history of two different peoples. You know what I mean?
And I think that, like, based on the, like, religious demographics of each area, that's going to affect the, like, cultural norms. So, like, if two nations are negotiating with each other and, like, one of them is predominantly, like, sun worshipping and one is moon worshipping, like, the sun worshipping one is going to, like, want to make a deal, like, right from the get-go. And, like, we're going to sit down and do this, and we're going to, like, write out this contract, and it's going to be this way. And, like, the other one is going to be much more like, okay, like, let's discuss this. Like, us having a negotiation is like, that just means we're talking about it. It doesn't mean that we're in or we're out. We're going to, like, sit down and, like, have a meal while we talk about this instead of, like, get in a room, get out,
I wonder, too, if, like, Mandi said she envisioned this as, like, an ancient thing, right?
Yes. Even in the era that we're talking about, I feel like this is this is not dominant.
Yeah. So I wonder if, like,
I guess, I mean, like, in areas where that used to be, then that has filtered into the culture.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so, like, you look at this as, like, cultures developing somewhat separately for a while, right? Like, they wouldn't have been intermingling as much, right? And let's assume that they did not conquer each other at any point, just for the sake of this now, because I'm kind of enjoying this, like, little thought exercise. Like, I wonder if maybe, like, they just developed into two different things. Like, a more pantheon-focused religion might have kind of, like, eventually kind of gone to, like, concepts, and then, like, it's a more spread and, like, less regiment. I'm trying to think of I don't know if there's, like, a real world analog for this.
I know what you're saying, but, like, 'cause I was gonna say for the sun people, I think it would be interesting where it's like they have seasons where they do things and seasons where they don't, and it's very taboo to not. Where it's like bad sun is like when we're allowed to, like, dominate and go to war and make unfriendly deals. And then good sun, like, we're not allowed to make deals at all. Like, you can't...
Well, do you think that they still do that today, or is that, like, in their history?
I think it's one of those things where it's, like, tradition.
So, yeah, like, you still do it today, but not for the reasons that you did it before. Like, you did it before because it's like, if you don't, like sun will punish you.
I'm trying to imagine a society where for half of the year you're not allowed to make deals.
Well, that was an example. Or something like, like, you can, like, do certain deals, but not others, like...
I think having, like, a warring season makes sense. And, like, blaming, like, the, like, fluxes in emotion on, like, oh, well, it's like this sun's dominant right now. Because that would seem very outlandish to people that worship, like, the moons that are changing constantly.
Right. Well, I kind of mean like a handshake thing. Like, handshakes were originally to check if people had weapons on them. But we still shake hands now, Where it's like, oh, they observe this thing where, like, you don't make deals, like, after sunset or something, And it's like...
Yeah, I mean, that can make sense. There's stuff like that I think could work.
Where it's like, do they still follow this? Like, no, but kind of.
Yeah, and, like, I think for, like, sun and moon... Like Mandi was saying with the Greek gods, like, people don't, like, worship them, but I think there are, like, habits or, like, superstitions that's like, oh, you just do it this way. Like, when you build a new thing, you always leave this for this goddess, and it's not, like, because you believe in this goddess, it's just like, well, my mom always did this, so I'm gonna do it.
Oh,
yeah.
I have an idea for, like, a holiday. Like, a big holiday is when the biggest moon goddess, like, the biggest moon eclipses the sun. Like, that's, like, in the ancient past, like, these were, like, antagonistic religions, but, like, on an eclipse, they, like, made a peace treaty or something, because it's, like, their gods were, like, meeting. So they, like, every, like, eclipse of, like, the biggest moon and the sun, they're just like, oh, this is, like, a special day where, like, everyone gets off of work and, like, we party.
That's a fun idea. I also like that eclipses would be kind of more frequent, right? They would just be like smaller versions of those eclipses. That's kind of a fun idea.
For nations, depending on how we want to do that, I thought like the idea of like having more like city-state stuff seems fun.
Well,
I think that might be more useful later.
Well, okay, so here's my thought on it. City-states make a great deal of sense when you have like an air, basically you're like divvying up like agriculture, and that is you're basic. It's basically like what's it called? Like feudalism, right? Is essentially what city-states are, and they have yet to band together and work together for any reason. You know, it's just distributed feudalism, right?
Yeah.
Which I think works, and I think it can lend itself to a lot more nations, or a lot more nations that are a lot less closely banded together. But that's kind of a question then that I have is like, what does conflict look like within this era? And I have a suggestion on that if y'all want to hear it, because I kind of like this city-state idea, but with some caveats.
Okay.
Yes, go for it.
Let's maybe imagine that large-scale war, just no one ever figured out the organization of that, right? That kind of requires a lot of hand-waving. Basically, the first people that did that were like the Romans, were the first one that logistically were able to field massive numbers of troops, right? Like, even within Europe, really pretty small conflicts, like, comparatively speaking, until, like, much later in history. Like, for a lot of medieval times, it was, like, way less because it was so divvied up and feudal, right? Because you essentially had, if not city-states, like, feudal chunks that could only have so many people in them, right?
Well, what if it's, like not just hand-waving, it's, like, the reason they can't capture these cities is just, like, it's, like, almost impossible to siege them because all cities are built on the lakes.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's part of it.
So it's just like they can always smuggle in food. So it's like you siege the city and they're like, okay, so we can't go outside for 2 years. And they're like, okay, you know.
Yeah. Let me think about this for a second. So the point that I was going to get to here is that, like, what modern conflict largely looks like is basically like crop stealing, because a lot of the land is basically unpersoned. And it's all focused around the same area. So, like, nations are much more realistically defined by the, like, chunks of farmland that they grab, because they're not as divided by, like, oceans and rivers. Or you said that it was less mountainous, right? So, like, those are traditionally the things that basically made nations happen, is that you either had, like, a body of water or a mountain between you. If you don't have a body of water or a mountain between you, then really there wouldn't be nearly as much, like, chopping up of the land, you know what I mean? But if you have kind of, like, traditionally, like, oh, like, these people held this chunk of farmland, you know, I think what it is now is that, like, raiding and banditry is a lot more possible. Like, if you have a low crop yield, it's pretty common that you have, like, these skirmishes far away from the cities, and it's always, like, hand-waving, like, proxy stuff, where it's, like, you have soldiers that defend the farmland, and then you have mercenaries attack it, right? But the soldiers never fight each other. It's always, like, these, like, backhanded, like, highway robberies are really common at this time.
Yeah, it's much more like Capture the Flag, or like Eagle's Eggs, if you've played that game.
I have
where you're,
not.
like, stealing. It's kind of like Capture the Flag, but you're, like, stealing these, like, fake
it's
eggs.
Capture the Flag, but instead of one flag, there's 5 flags all in the same spot.
Yeah.
And so, like, you're not fighting each other. You're just, like, trying to take stuff before they take your stuff.
Yeah, and I think that, like, armed conflict happens. It's just pretty rare that it's on, like, a massive scale, because it's much more focused on just, like, we're trying to, like, siphon off. It's way more like, can we manage to harvest your field without you even noticing? Or, like, rob one of your things without you even noticing, and then being like, run, you know?
Well, right, because conflicts are really resource heavy.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to conserve resources because you're low,
Right.
you just want to get in and get out and steal the stuff.
Right.
And not meet anybody.
Well, and maybe that's, like, always been, like, kind of a cultural thing, is almost like that, like, robbing of grain is, like, almost kind of like how, like, stock car racing got invented, which is, like, bootleggers running from cops. Kind of like that level of, like, pursuit and chase is, like, pretty integral in the culture of just, like, the entire world, because this kind of, like, crop theft has become so common, and, like, kind of has been for a long time.
This is definitely the main sport now.
Yeah, there'd be some version of this, that like that has been sportified, because like we sportify a lot of like, stuff that it has grimmer startings,
I like this a lot.
Yeah, that's cool. So I think tensions between nations is largely derivative of, this, there is beginning to be like monoculture plagues are becoming super common, crop shortages are low. This thing that had kind of traditionally been almost like depending on how bad it is, like almost assumed like pranks that can lead to like actual armed conflict if it gets bad enough, is now frequently leading into like pseudo barony tendencies out in the farmland. And then meanwhile, the cities are trying to largely ignore it, as like their food production is being like stolen and, like everyone's robbing from everyone, but we all just kind of like look away because it's so far away. I kind of like that.
I also like the way this is set up. Like the reason that that people don't go and conquer each other is they're like, well, then I have to feed more people, and that I don't want to do.
Well, yeah, you ideally, you get more farmland than. So, what do we think is like the thing that like the large inciting thing that makes people realize this like shift to an eco herb is necessary? So, society, like something happens, and society is like, oh shoot, we have to make a change. What do we think that is? And this is where we're going to end the episode, is deciding on this. I like the idea that the tension is coming from, you have a monoculture plant that is being fed into like synthesizers that works, but both it is damaging the land and also resource intensive. And then also there begins to be plant like crop shortages due to this blight that came from having so much stagnant water, then leading to like this thing that used to be like friendly to not like open war skirmishes being pretty common on the borders to now being like bloody conflict is pretty common along borders where it used to be kind of like cops and robbers skirmishes. Now it's like becoming more and more open conflict on borders because of like robbery of crops.
I'm trying to think of something that makes sense because I have like 3 or 4 ideas rattling around.
I was going to say, so my suggestion, we do not have to go with this. I think it's a rare, huge storm that just like, it's like a category 4 hurricane type storm where everything gets knocked out. We've lost crops. We've lost machinery that can no longer support it. It's a big enough storm that it crosses borders. So everybody is hit, and we realize that we don't have a backup plan.
I have a yes and for that, but other people go.
I also have a yes and. I think it would be interesting if in these like skirmishes, people start damaging the dams, like the electric plants. So all of a sudden, like, there's like this rush of water, like not like all of a sudden, but like over the course of like 6 months, everyone's like, oh, we can blow up each other's dams. And then like they're stuck rebuilding that so we can steal their crops. And that raises the water level enough that all of a sudden like this storm can happen again.
It's kind of an interesting idea.
Whereas like, it's like all of a sudden we have a lot more water here that is now sucked up into the atmosphere and then causes this category 4 thing.
Caitlin and Vinny, any ideas? It's okay, like, I have kind of like cohesivizing this thing that I can say if none of you want to throw anything else in, but also totally cool if you want to have input right now.
I think all that sounds good.
Yeah, I think that all sounded fine to me.
So I think the way I'm going to blend all this together is this. For the first time in history, I will say their modern history, right? There used to be open conflict between these like more divvied up like farmland nations, but it's like, look, we all work together on this monocrop thing. Sure, we steal from each other, but not that much. It's more of a game. Things get bad, stealing starts happen, and then for like the first time in a very long time, there is like open declaration of war. 2 city-states, 2 very large ones, go to actual war with each other, right? And it's like, just in the cities, you're like beginning to start to feel the effects of it. Like, you're like hearing stories about like conscription might become necessary. Like, well, actually, that's an interesting thing. We'll talk about that. I think maybe conscription was always like assumed as like, you spend part of your life as like a border guard, whatever. That used to be a pretty low-key, like, do a couple of summers in. Oh, actually, that's kind of a fun idea that like a lot of young people spend their times in the fields seeing how crappy it is, because that's like their required guard duty is you got to go out there and patrol the fields for a certain amount of time, you know? That suddenly starts getting bloody, right? Gets pretty desperate. And I think that is when you, like Zach said, you start seeing like, because like these reports wouldn't be like newsfeed. It would be like occasionally you would get like these text printouts of communication of like, what's going on in the farmlands? This is what's going on. Like, these are getting more violent. People are burning crops now, which is unheard of. And then you get the like, report of like the dam breaks, right? That's crazy. Why would they ever do that? And then that's when that freak storm happens. And that you can like almost see from the city, right? This massive storm that's just like demolishing huge parts of like machinery, farmland that no one had assumed that no one would have assumed has ever needed to withstand these types of storm, because they've been unheard of up to this point. And I think the thing that made this one specifically different is it lasted far enough to actually like devastate a city. Massive buildings that were never meant to withstand high winds toppling. Like, you kind of watch almost an entire nation fall, and people are dealing. Now it's like, its borders now are not dealing with conflict. They're dealing with like sudden influxes of refugees and like farmland that is now useless because it got flooded and all the machinery is destroyed and there's basically no purpose in trying to rebuild it. It's like the first time that you see the land return itself to the wild. And I think that is like the wake up call that makes people realize a change is needed. And then my addition to this is I think that this coincides with the launching of the first satellites, which makes vocal instant communication possible through like a satellite network that gets launched. So that's like the horrible stuff happens, and then like the like moment of hope is like leaders of the world finally able to talk for the first time, you know, in real time. And that's kind of like that conversation is what transitions us to the next era. Thanks for listening to this episode of Wanderlust. Music for this show is credited down below. If you like this campaign, you can find more of our shows at the Wandering Gamer website or on Podbean. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Links in the description. Now bear in mind, in the wilds, some wander to get lost, and some wander to find themselves.